Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome, first of all, representing the Embassy of Indonesia in Australia, Ibu Dr. Marcia Pramono Kustiananda, Ibu, and San Satrio. Selamat datang. The Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific, the Australian National University, Professor Helen Sullivan, Emeritus Professor Anthony Johns, Yohanni Johns and family, our distinguished speaker, Professor Michael Laffin of Princeton University and family, honored guests, colleagues, students and friends, welcome to the 2025 Tony and Yohanni Johns Lecture at the ANU Indonesia Institute. I'm Jara Sastrawan, Lecturer of Indonesian History and Language at the School of Culture, History and Language at the College of Asia and Pacific here at the ANU. To begin, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today for this lecture, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. I also acknowledge all First Nations people who are here with us today, whose knowledge traditions go back tens of thousands of years. I'd like to open this event by considering the formation of a knowledge tradition that has brought us here today in this room, the study of Indonesia in Australia and at the Australian National University. This lecture, as you well know, is named in honor of Tony and Yohanni Johns, for whose presence here today we are extremely grateful. They came to Canberra in the late 1950s as pioneers of the nation's study of Indonesia. They laid the groundwork for ANU's ongoing expertise in Southeast Asian studies, including the teaching of Malay, Indonesian, and Arabic. The Joneses' approach to research and teaching underscored the fact that three elements are inseparable: culture, cultural understanding, historical investigation, and linguistic proficiency. Tony's own engagement with Malay and Javanese texts reshaped our understanding of Southeast Asia's place in the Islamic world. That theme remains starkly relevant today, and it's one on which Professor Laffin's lecture tonight is going to offer a really intriguing perspective that I suspect will be new to many of us. Tony and Yohanni Johns mentored successive generations of scholars at the ANU, including a dear colleague whom we have recently farewelled, the leading historian of Southeast Asia, Emeritus Professor Anthony Reid. This annual lecture was established through the generosity of Tony Reid and his family and friends, and also the friends and family of the Johns. This is the first of these lectures since Tony Reid's passing, and we celebrate his legacy and thank him for his role in strengthening that tradition here at the ANU. Professor Laffin has also been part of that tradition, having received his undergraduate training in Asian Studies and Arabic here at the ANU. As we will see this evening, Professor Laffin's research helps us to situate Indonesia within a broader Indian Ocean world. His expansive historical vision of Islam appears in his latest book, entitled Under Empire, Muslim Lives and Loyalties Across the Indian Ocean World, which won the General History Prize at the New South Wales Premier's History Awards in 2023. Here at the ANU, in the College of Asia and the Pacific, and at the Indonesia Institute, we are continuing to develop this tradition of knowledge through our commitment to Indonesian language teaching, to research on its culture and history, and to nurturing future generations of students, whether they're Australians, Indonesians, or come from anywhere else in the world, who will keep that tradition thriving. I thank you for coming along today, and now I invite the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific, Professor Helen Sullivan, to open the lecture and to introduce our speaker this evening.
Well, it's incredibly difficult to follow such a marvelous introduction. And if anybody needed any convincing, and I know that the community of people who care passionately about Asia and the Pacific studies at the ANU always need convincing, I think evidence of Jara and Jara's articulate expression of what it is we have always been here to do at the College of Asia and the Pacific, and what we are encouraging the next generation, which includes people like the wonderful Jara, the amazing Ellie Kent. Please be assured that the future is safe, very safe in their hands. I'm Helen Sullivan. I have the very great privilege of being the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you all here today, to extend a special welcome to our distinguished guests, and also, of course, to our very special guest speaker, Professor Michael Laffin of Princeton University. I would also like to acknowledge and celebrate the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded and that it is a very great privilege to live and work on these lands that have been cared for centuries. I'm always honoured to welcome Tony and Yohanni Johns and their family of friends here this evening. And it's also a particular pleasure to, and I know he's here because I've seen him, to welcome Emeritus Professor Greg Feely. Where are you, Greg? Over there, who was the first orator for this lecture. And it is wonderful that he keeps coming back to hear how well other people are doing. But Tony and Yohanni, it is a very great privilege to have you with us. As Jara said, the lecture was established in 2022 with the great support and commitment of our dearly departed colleague, Tony Reid, who we miss every day. And what I want to say, in addition to assuring you that of your confidence in the next generation of scholars, we are committed at this institution, and I am committed as a monolingualist myself. I am absolutely committed to the 16 languages that we continue to teach here at the college. As many of you are aware, language teaching, along with many of the other humanities subjects, are increasingly under threat, but not here and not now. And we are extremely privileged to benefit from funding that enables us to support these languages, and we will continue to do so. Now, we, of course, are not alone in honouring the legacy of Tony and Yohanni Johns. As you may know, Yohanni Johns was awarded a Medal of the Order of Australia in the 2024 King's Birthday Honours List. And Emeritus Professor Tony Johns, not to be outdone, received the same honour in the 2025 King's Birthday Honours List. So if you have any other family members that you think may be eligible for nomination, clearly you're on a winning streak, but they are incredibly well-deserved honours. We're incredibly delighted to be able to support this lecture and to welcome extraordinary speakers every year, and this year is no exception. Professor Michael Laffin of Princeton University, who got his BA, it says here, in Asian Studies sometime in the 1990s. We're not going to be any more specific than that. Fair enough. I also understand, and I've never met Michael before, and he will probably never speak to me again after I tell him this, but I also understand that he's given Professor Tony Johns a preview of the lecture and received some interesting feedback. So he's not at all daunted by the prospect of speaking in front of all of you. But please now join me in welcoming Professor Laffin to give the 2025 Tony and Yohanni Johns lecture entitled Jesus, Mary and the Occasional Tiger, Muslim Retellings to the Malay.
Yeah, I wanted to just start by acknowledging Yohanni and Tony, who were so important for my formation as a scholar when I was an undergrad here. I think it was 1994 that I graduated, or they let me go. And I was always, whether it was in Indonesian classes where Yohanni would express her frustration, "You should know this," she would say to us again and again. Or Tony gave his wonderfully crafted lectures about the history of Islam in Asia, the Quran in translation. And I have to say that I feel very awkward today. I think of myself as something of a social historian or political historian, writing more about the 19th century, the 20th century, than a textualist or a philologist. And I thought, though, that because of the nature of those being honoured, I would try and tread in Tony's footsteps a little bit and tackle a text. And I thought, what better to do than tackle a text I hadn't actually read yet, but was very curious about. For a start, when I first noticed it at Princeton University, I had just assumed that it was some sort of missionary tract trying to convince Muslims to come over, and with a very strange formulation that there was no God but God and that Jesus was the Spirit of God. And I was completely ignorant, of course, that this is a very standard Muslim formulation for the mission of Jesus, and there is an active tradition about the life and miracles of Jesus. Now, I should start with the text itself. As we see here, it's nicely written. I think it was actually written for somebody as something of a presentation copy. We see the rubrication, the red text, is usually for Arabic, or what the scribe thought was Arabic, and important link words that take you from one section to another. So here we have the opening of the text. But what to call it? And also I realised that this text was far more common than I'd initially thought. It just goes by various names. In the catalogue of Princeton University, it was called the Hikayat Maryam wa Isa, the story of Mary and Jesus. And that, in large part, was down to something was written on one of the... Oh, that's fantastic. I knew this would happen. It's back. But am I? On the flyleaf, we see here, written up here, Hikayat Maryam wa Isa, and then in Dutch and French, and the explanation is a history of Mary, the saint, in Malay of the Saints Mary and Jesus. As far as I could tell, it was owned certainly by the man, and I only realised this the other day in looking at a photograph with his, I think his handwriting on it, the resident of Batavia, Dutch official by the 1850s. But it had been collected by his father, whose signature we find here, and I think he had been a scribe working for the Dutch colonial state. And he had had this copied about 10 years after the British occupation of Java, or at least he got hold of this copy about 10 years after the occupation of Java by the British, and it's returned to Dutch hands. Now, I don't know why he ended up with the copy. I also don't know how it went from the hands of this family, Dutch family, the Schaap family, sheep family, had been. That's why there's the lame joke about the lamb. Were based in Batavia, and that in fact the future resident had been born and educated there. So why did he own it? I became curious though about the text, and another one that I've, for the purposes of constructing this and reading this, I also read another copy that is now held in Paris. It's about 10 years older, and it's pretty similar, but they're not exactly the same. There are quite often distinctions, which seems to point to a text that had been floating around sometime earlier, probably in the 18th century at least. And there are other pointers as to where parts of this story came from. Now, I say this story, like many hikayats, it should be seen really as a compilation, a bricolage, if you like, of different texts, sometimes citing different authorities. At times it's clear that the writer was drawing on what we might call the Qisas al-Anbiya, the stories of the Prophet, the very standard Islamic stories. There are other times, though, where stuff just seems to come from somewhere else. So, for example, and I should warn you as I try to explain some of the stories here, and if I go too long, just stop me somehow. I should say that many of the images I use are completely ahistorical. It's a rubricated manuscript, but it's not an illuminated manuscript. So there are no pictures inside here. Very much what would have been summoned up in the minds of either the reader or the listener is, I will argue, a very Indonesian sort of space, one in which Jerusalem is a long, long way away, and that the former inhabitants of Jerusalem, starting with Zachariah, and I should say that the spine itself identifies the text as being the Hikayat Zachariah, because it starts with the story of Zachariah rather than Mary or yet Jesus, although the bulk of the action, if you like, concerns them. So we start with Zachariah and the problem of young Mary. Maryam is orphaned, and Zachariah, who is the head of it's said to be thousands of scholars living in Jerusalem of the day. They were trying to work out what to do with her. Who is it appropriate should look after her? And then we have the relating, quite faithful relating, of one of the standard Muslim narratives, and that is the miracle of the pens, by which all the men of Jerusalem were required to write their names and the names of their fathers on the pens, which were then, it says, thrown into the sea, although I suspect the Galilee was the original destination. And somehow it's only Zachariah's pen that comes to the top. It's because of lots of help from the angels who are pushing all the other pens down. Zachariah now has a job, and that's to look after Mary, who's marked as an extremely pious young woman. She prefers to stay in the mosque, and again, the term that is used at all times is mosque, masjid, not temple, or even mihrab. That is the prayer locus in the mosque. But there's something about this relationship that was Zachariah, the uncle effectively of Maryam. He brings her food each day. And it seems that the food that she liked the most was something that was unfamiliar to the scribes. In both manuscripts that I looked at, they talk about a thing called upama. So any Indonesians out there eat much upma? Indonesian? Exactly, yeah. So it's a very common, it's a semolina porridge, although in the text, in this case, it says that it's made of corn. So it's a very foreign sounding food that is being delivered each day. But it does point, I think, in a certain direction of transmission for at least part of the stories that are in this text. But the other thing to remember is these stories are so common across these spaces, whether it's in the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen, southern India, or what we now call Indonesia. And I would also argue, I'll try and suggest throughout, that although I talked about this being written or addressed to a Malay world, it's written in Malay, it's very Javanese in flavour. There are a lot of times where the scribe will use a Javanese verb rather than a more standard Malay one, and the vocalisation seems to point to someone who was probably living not too far from Batavia and perhaps away from the courts. So what else happens? We should say that upma doesn't seem to be the most exciting of foods. And indeed, Gabriel and Michael have a word with God upstairs, I'm very loosely paraphrasing here, and decide to deliver a much more varied diet to her. So hosts of angels will frequently bring the fruits of heaven down to Maryam, much to Zachariah's surprise. But Zachariah, although surprised, is convinced by Maryam. She enunciates the notion that God will feed whom he likes. Fine, that seems like proof enough to me. Where did all this food come from? Oh, it obviously came from heaven, and the angels were always invisible at the time of Zachariah's arrival. But the angels would keep visiting, and as the very pious Maryam would learn, would look after her in various ways, as, for example, with the onset of menses, she's informed that she can no longer stay in the mosque, and therefore the angels descend, and Gabriel in particular constructs a dome for her to bathe unseen by others. Now this story, it's not a particularly Indonesian story. It's to be found again in other places and other traditions, as is the news that Gabriel brings that she is going to give birth to a prophet. But here we have, I think, a very strange Indonesian kink in the story. Gabriel is instructed to go to the place and find the earth where Adam was created, take some of that and take it to Maryam. And then here it gets very unusual. Gabriel presents Mary with a nose made of clay. Now, I'm not quite sure what happens with the nose, but it seems that it's brought in contact with her, and then later we have this reference, and I've included for those who read Indonesian some vocalization. It references that the nose is consumed by Mary in some way, and then by God that she becomes pregnant, and God then asks the question of Jesus, who are you? Who am I? To which Jesus replies that you are God, there is no God other than you, the one and only, the most generous. Now, it's a sort of a variation on these standard declarations about who God is. Now, this happening, this pregnancy, doesn't go unnoticed. And of course, the person who decides to find out about this is the ever-jealous figure of Iblis, the devil. Now, he's been jealous before. He's going to be jealous again, probably. Jealous of the creation of Adam, now jealous of the creation or the pregnancy of Mary. He stirs up trouble in the community, in the story. Tells us that it is decided that Joseph is to be brought to Mary to quiz her about how this pregnancy came about. Now, Joseph doesn't play the part that we have in the Christian tradition of being her husband or protector. Rather, we just have someone who is sent in to ask questions. But the questions all get turned around, and Joseph is soon convinced. But he's convinced by Mary's mastery of an argument for how the world is created. They have a whole series of back and forths about, well, where is the throne? Who sits on the throne? God sits on the throne. Where is the throne? The throne is above the seven heavens. The seven heavens are above the circle of the earth. The earth is surrounded by the mountains of Kaf. And then a long section which Mary points out, do you not know that God, when he created the wheat, had no need of seed, and that God, by his power, made the trees grow without the help of rain? All that God had to do was to say, so be it, and it was done. Kun fayakun. And this, rubricated throughout the text, is often brought up. This is the argument that's often pushed back. It's to say that Jesus the prophet had no need of a father. And it's a central tenet of the Islamic tradition, that Jesus has no father, and also that he is the Spirit of God, or at least the breath of God, the Ruh Allah. And this is where I think the nose comes in handy. Adam had a nose through which God, in his nostrils, that God breathed life. Similarly, Jesus is brought to life by the nostrils, by the nose that is brought to him by Gabriel. But it's not to imply in any way that Jesus is equal to God or a part of him. He is just created by God. He is just a prophet. I mean, there's not... And of course, being a prophet is a pretty powerful thing. Again, even if you have this proof that Joseph, who is regarded as a man who can never lie, that he momentarily assuages the crowd, Iblis gets to work, and Mary decides that when the time comes to give birth, she flees into the desert, and she flees to an oasis or that has not seen water for hundreds of years, and Jesus' presence makes it green, and Mary overcomes her fear and also her pain. She sort of basically says, oh, kill me now, I don't want to go through with this. And Jesus speaks to her and says, no, trust in God, it is the time, and he is born. Now, not only is he born, though, in this very vivid retelling, we have the Bani Israel. And the terms Bani Israel and Qaum Yahudi are used sometimes interchangeably, but sometimes not. They are said to come out in their thousands looking for Mary because Iblis has told them that Mary plans to kill her child. Instead, they find the child Jesus, the infant Jesus, suckling at Mary's breast. He won't answer their questions. Who are you? Who's your dad? Where'd you come from? Until he finally gets sick of it and thinks that his mum's being harassed far too much, detaches himself, climbs down, stands up, pulls up a staff, clears his throat, and then says who he is. And indeed that he is a servant of God. I won't go through the whole thing, but he has been made by God to be a messenger to them and to basically ensure that people do good during his lifetime. So Jesus, we've had the setup story. Jesus is on the earth. He can do anything from the age. And there are sort of tweakings. If you want the story of Jesus speaking in the womb or Jesus speaking as the child, there are analogous traditions in some of the Christian traditions that describe Jesus speaking from the cradle, for example, but it's not the same. But I think one thing I would point out is that there's a lot of bleeding in and out of traditions between old Christian traditions, non-standard traditions, I should say, and also things that come from Yemen that are known as Israeliyat, these sort of Jewish traditions that infuse the story as it goes forward. Now, in the text, then, we have something of an interlude, and I've been extremely loose with my images, I have to say. So, for example, we have the story of Zechariah and his son Yahya. Now, in the Christian tradition that many of us here might know, John the Baptist, as we call him, is born before Jesus. But in this story, it's set about the other way. It's Zechariah complaining of his age, his infirmity, his grey hair, and that of his wife. He complains a lot, by the way. He prays for a son and is given one, who is given the unprecedented name of Yahya or John. Now, we probably have trouble thinking of John as an unprecedented name. I don't know if it's quite so popular these days. I think it's still used marginally more than Michael, or I hope it is. But we have the story of Zechariah, his wife, and his wife is never named in this text, and I should say very few women are named in this text at all. They're just referred as the woman, the wife. It's only Maryam, really, and I think in one instance her servant, Rahma, who gave away the story of her pregnancy, that get names. So in the Zechariah tradition, everything seems to be fine. His son turns 3, though, and then won't play and just cries all the time because he's so unhappy about the irreligion of the people around him. Zechariah is increasingly ignored by people. He runs away. He's been pursued by a mob. He calls to God for some aid, to Gabriel, and they supply him with a tree in which he hides. But unfortunately, Iblis is on hand and points out that a thread from his turban is to be seen. And they're, aha! So he's hiding in here. Well, what to do about it? And Iblis, of course, says, well, we could cut him out. And they say, how are we going to cut him out? Well, you need a saw. Oh, we don't have a saw. That's all right, I'll make you one. And sure enough, we have the narrative again, very standard though, of the martyrdom of Zechariah. Yahya, meanwhile, John, never called the Baptist, he's not used in this story to validate or point out the mission of Jesus. He too rises as a scholar. He's referred to by many people, but he too gets martyred because he refuses to marry a woman that we might call Salome, and who was imagined here in a 19th century French painting, and her cousin. And she's very influential. She ensures that he is killed and martyred. And now I think one of the 6 graves of John is included, is an image here of one in Damascus today, in the Great Mosque of Damascus. But in this story, there's a twist. Again, something of an Indonesian twist in that Salome, well, I call her Salome, doesn't get away with it. There she is. They describe a wedding in which the couple, now freed of this problematic antagonist, are able to marry, but God causes her to be blown into the jungle in her finest kind, whereupon she is caught by 2 tigers and eaten. So there is a happy ending after all. Now, I should say, tigers, not generally regarded as a correct standard feature of the Arabian landscape. But the other thing about this, without telling you much about the landscape, you often get the impression that you are in a place that's more like Java than Arabia. There are references to the sorts of animals that are around. I mean, snakes are in both places, obviously. But it seems or feels like a very jungly place or a wetter place than we might imagine sometimes. It's also clear that there are parts of daily life that people are used to by the time of this recounting. The idea that young boys are sent to school, for example. And we have an account, again, this is found in other traditions, I won't say necessarily allied, Christian traditions, the story of Jesus and the schoolmaster, for example, who becomes his first convert, where the schoolmaster, first he was reluctant to take Jesus on, but Mary insisted because he was so small, would ask him how to pronounce things, and Jesus, of course, fires back, well, you pronounce that well, but do you know what it means? And there's all like let's go on to the next letter, and goes through all the various letters of the alphabet. And Jesus always turns into the questioner, which raises the hackles of the teacher. But then the teacher has basically, how would I say it? He's basically taught by the very young Jesus. As the teacher says to his mother, "Belum aku melihat seorang pun juga seperti engkau, budak ini, kecil-kecil berkata-kata terlalu cerdik." And then he loses his temper, and Jesus sort of calms him down. In this story, it's known. And the other story I thought was an entirely Indonesian invention, but I just found out today, fortunately, that it is a variation on another one. In one Persianate story, Jesus is able to produce from a vat of single colour raiment of numerous colours. And that's not the story we have here. Instead, though, we have a bargain by which Jesus is a trickster. He's apprenticed to a dyer whom he works for, and when the dyer is away, he dyes everybody's clothes black. Now, this makes everyone furious because, you know, their fabrics are the most valuable things that they have. And we also have to think about the possession of fabric in Southeast Asia and kind of how important it is. And so Jesus, who won't change anyone's stuff back until his mother comes and says, look, you've got to stop doing this. Your boss is super upset. He's tearing his hair out. He's gnashing his teeth. And Jesus is like, all right, but only to show my connection, if you like, to the divine. And it's at this point that Jesus then says, I will change your clothes back to the colour, whatever colour you like, in exchange for you converting to my religion. In exchange for you saying that I testify there is no God but God and that Jesus is the Spirit of God. So a few people say, well, yeah, okay, show us. And sure enough, the person whose clothes were red, he gets them red again. The person whose clothes were white gets them white again, etc., etc. The person who had a very complicated pattern gets the perfectly complicated pattern back. This is not a standard story. But it does reflect a lot of invention on the part of the compiler, let's say. But it also includes, it throws in things there that are very strange. For ages, I struggled with pasunila. I mean, what on earth is a pasunila? Because he was using it a lot. And then I realised it's a Nile vase, so a large earthen jug. And it's in this earthen jug that he's putting people's things and pulling them out in whatever colour they desired. Or, in the case of one woman, he has to change her clothes no less than 3 times, and still she won't make the attestation that he is the prophet and that the Spirit of God. To which she's given a rather nasty rejoinder by Jesus and said, well, you'll see later on you're going to become a monkey. And sure enough, it says she was turned into a monkey. Now, or an ape. Again, this is not an Indonesian tradition. It's a rather problematic tradition that comes out of Yemen. The idea that those who fail to heed a message, Christians and Jews, have been turned into monkeys and pigs in some instances. So it's a story that had been floating around there. Not necessarily a story I think people would necessarily repeat today. Now, as Jesus grows up, and I'll try and skip through a bit of the rest to save you, unless you're very comfortable. If you're very comfortable, it's all right. Just stay falling asleep. So it's decided that, and with this, it's signalled by this instance. Occasionally, God commands things. Usually the word is tita, manita. There's a tita from God, and it's to be followed. In this case, though, we have wahi, sort of like an inspiration. And in the Javanese tradition, this is often indicated by light from heaven. And it's like it's time to switch on into active mission mode. And what we find in this story, though, is that Jesus' first mission is not to the people around him, or at least not according to the scribe who came up with this in the first place. It's a mission that sounds, again, much more about the world in which he or perhaps she lived. And that's to go east, to go away from the Jewish people, to head towards Jabal Qaf, the mountain of Qaf. Now, Jabal Qaf features in Islamic tradition as it has a very mystical resonance in that sort of imagining of the world that we saw before. The Jabal Qaf are the mountains that encircle the earth, that then sits on the back of the giant cow, which is on the giant fish, which Mary knew all about and convinced her cousin was the case. And we also find that guarding the Jabal Qaf is a king, a man possessed of 80 gateways. And Jesus takes with him his first convert, the teacher. Now, the teacher is not in a particularly comfortable position. Jesus says, I want you to go to the gate, to the king, who is guarded by all his ministers and war captains, and I want you to make him say that he has to attest that there is no God but God, and Jesus is the Spirit of God. And the teacher is like, well, I could do that, but they might sort of beat me up a bit. And he's like, no, don't worry about it. You'll be fine. So he sends him off. And of course, he not only gets beaten up, he gets killed. Jesus, though, finds out about it, finds him the next day. His body restores him to life. Thank you, Jesus. And he says, right, I want you to go and do it again. And he has to go and do it again. This time the king is, didn't we kill you yesterday? Well, I've got, that's pretty amazing. And then his ministers sort of come in and say, no, I think this is the wrong plan here. This time we'll really chop him up and feed him to the animals, which they do. No problem for Jesus. Jesus has command over the animals, instructs the animals to bring him up, put him back together, and send him off to do it again. Again, I haven't found this particular tradition. The Paris manuscript has an even more complicated, difficult restructuring job for Jesus that involves the bits being burned and put on mountaintops and then blown away by the wind. But don't worry, the angels have got it and they get him all back together. It's also a bit unfair, I feel, for the teacher, because he had been enjoying a little bit of the benefits of heaven before he got called back. At least he knew where he was going next time. Now, again, I talked about those to whom the mission was sent sound very familiar. They talk about the Raja. They talk about his mantri, his ministers, his hulu balang, his war captains, his rakyat. And in the end, they are convinced and they convert. And then Jesus decides, well, I'm glad they're converting. This isn't such a great place anyway. And he decides with Mary to go into occultation. And they go to a giant mountain, which is said to be 300 years' journey by a normal person's legs. And I should say too, with the travel aspect, when the teacher and Jesus travel, it sounds very much more like an Indonesian adventure story, that mountains are made to become flat for their passing. They fly across rivers. They're able to pass through the environment with magical ease. But then Jesus withdraws, and Mary, and it's here that they decide for a time to carry out ascetic, if you like, concentration prayer by day and by night. And both texts talk about the construction of a mandarsa. And I don't know what that is. I know what it feels like. It sounds like a place of study or a reflection, but it's not actually a word in either Arabic or Indonesian or Javanese or Sundanese as far as I can tell. But you get the sense. Now, while Jesus is out, again, here's a big difference in the Muslim tradition. Time has come for Mary, and she's visited by the angel of death, the Malik al-Maut. They have a fairly friendly conversation. She sort of tries to ask, do I get to go and see God? And he's like, well, no, I just take your soul. I think you should just sort of drop there and don't worry, Jesus will sort things out. It's a very matter-of-fact sort of story. And then a disconsolate Jesus returns and is helped by the angels prepare her body for burial. And here we have reference to the silks that are referred to in the Quran, but also the sandalwood that's used to prepare the body. And Jesus descends from his mountain, the 300-year journey, to a small village, it sounds like in Java, to collect the fabric to wrap her body. But Jesus is, understandably, extremely upset. One of the first things he had announced when he first appeared on his mission was, apart from being the emissary of God, was that he was going to be obedient to his mother for as long as he lived. Now, his mother is no longer with him, and he wants, though, to be able to speak to her. And you have in the manuscript him asking the favour of God to be able to speak to his mother beyond the grave. And interestingly, it's Muhammad who is invoked as the intercessor. Muhammad yet to come, Muhammad al-Mustafa, the chosen one, is it's sort of the key term here. And it's throughout the rest of the manuscript, you see this anticipation, if you like, that the greatest person yet to come is Muhammad, and Jesus is just a placeholder, if you like, a way, a step on the path towards Muhammad. So he goes, again, we have more missions, if you like, but again, it feels like a non-Middle Eastern space. They talk about islands great and small. Their encounters with walis, with saints, and Jesus carries out these sort of acts that we would be familiar with if we're in the Christian tradition of making the lame walk, the blind see, the deaf hear, etc. Although one particularly fortunate/unfortunate young man who is cured of all these afflictions is then sent repeatedly to a Raja to try and arrange for his conversion yet again. And the same sort of story takes place. It's a repeat of the teacher's story, whereby the initial response is a hard no, followed by very sharp, pointy things. We also have reference, though, and there's some 30-odd pages of this sort of missionizing, if you like, to people who need to believe, but they need miracles at all times. And there is a difference here in that Muhammad does not bring with him a miracle per se, other than the Quran, the revelation. Jesus, there's no reference anywhere to him bringing a book or a text, although Muslims will commonly say that he brings the Injil. There's no reference to a divine text or anything like that. It's much more about practical miracle making and convincing the unwilling. I could speak of more of these miracles, including, for example, the reluctant king who's only convinced when Jesus exhumes his parents, who then tell him that they're not in a very nice place because they hadn't believed in Jesus. And he's like, all right, yep, sign me up and all my people. And we see a lot of signing up. And yet there's a return, if you like, to a much more standard narrative, a Middle Eastern narrative, and it's a return away from lands of acceptance in the East, in the islands, to places of rejection. And also the invoking of at least one authority that we can identify, and that's Ka'b al-Ahbar, who was a Jewish convert from Yemen and is also responsible for many of the so-called Israeliyat, the Jewish stories of conversion that got merged and folded into the Islamic tradition. So it's back to a much more shared, and I'd say Arabic, if not Quranic tradition. There are more Quranic quotes to come, and there's more stuff to be deployed that perhaps someone who knows the more standardized or the now agreed story of Jesus in the Muslim tradition would identify. So, for example, Jesus meets a monk. It's not specified what sort of monk he is, but the use of the term rahib would indicate perhaps a Christian. And the monk says, well, what's a Nabi without miracles? You've got to show me a miracle. And of course, one of the miracles he produces is to turn some clay birds into living birds. This again is found in one of the Christian apocrypha. And Jesus also, Isa, acquires followers, 12 of them, but not with the names that I think many of you would recognize. I don't know where these names come from. There's perhaps a Peter in there. There's a Paul, Bulus. But otherwise, I'm a little bit lost. So these names, the Christian tradition that we know of is certainly alien to this transmission. Although it's worth saying that at the time that this text was being written down, missionaries were appearing and were finally being a little bit more interested in the spaces that the Dutch had influence in or control over for quite some time. Now, Isa's 12 are not labourers, they're not fishermen. At one point, they all complain about being dragged into the desert and made to go around. And they say, look, we're the sons of aristocrats. We're not used to this sort of privation. And rather than being rejected by Isa, he summons food from heaven, as you would. And then it's this transition, if you like, into the latter stages of the Hikayat is to be identified with in the Quran. You have the Surat al-Ma'idah, the miracle of the table, the heavenly table, the constant feast. The people who would feed at the table would be able to be healed, cured of whatever ailment, or in fact the poor would go away rich. And it's only when the already rich begin to reject this story and start to say, well, hang on, this isn't for us. This is turning society upside down, that we see a cooling in the atmosphere, if you like, towards Isa. And there's frequently reference to the rejection of Jesus by the Qawm Yahudi or the Bani Israel. And again, there's a confused fate in the manuscript. In Arabic, there's an Ethiopic term for the disciples. They're the Hawariyun. But in this text, the Hawariyun are just identified as a particular group of Jews who reject Jesus. So it goes completely against the notion of, well, who the 12 disciples are. So there's no sort of connecting here by any of the scribes or the original author with that. And again, we have this sort of deal. You convert. If you're going to eat at the table, you convert to Jesus' religion. If you reject it, then you are liable to end up something unpleasant living in a jungle. And it's often mentioned, pigs or monkeys, things like that. Now, I realise I'm running out of time here, and as was Isa at this point of the narrative. And it's clear that you couldn't please everyone. But what we do have is, towards the end of the account, is those who reject Jesus gather against him. His life is in threat. He hides in a house, and another person in that house is made to resemble him. And Jesus is spirited away up to heaven, where he is to await the moment to return. There is no death for Jesus. There's no crucifixion, at least in this narrative. There's the sense that the person who was made to look like Jesus is threatened by the crowd but is not actually killed. And again, there are variant Muslim traditions about whether someone was crucified or executed in his place. But rather, what we have is it's left open, and Jesus leaves the scene, and with that, the Hikayat just tails off. So, what are we to make of this? And why is it not more commonly known? Maybe parts of the story are commonly known, but I think it's worth noting that in the 19th century, that did not come out at all well. This was actually already published in the 1850s in Jawi script. The Christian missionaries are trying to get in with their own version of the Hikayat Isa. But I think far more importantly, it's reform-minded Muslims like one of the men who had in fact assisted the Christian missionaries in Singapore, Munshi Abdullah, wasn't really into this sort of apocrypha. And you could see that the accounts that are being published henceforth are much more in line with the translations of more standardized, accepted stories coming from the Middle East, and mostly from Arabic rather than anything else. So we don't quite see an Indian or Persian vector here. But again, I'm really at the beginning of this, and I just feel that it's fairly clear too in the manuscript that this manuscript is never printed. So it doesn't end up being continued. It just ends up as something of a curio in various collections and marked in various different ways. And we got to a point where in the 19th century, the conversion of unknown kings and mystical islands is not really necessary anymore to tell the story of the prophet who came before the one that really mattered. So, thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Michael. Really broad-ranging, I think, set of implications for what we might read into this quite unusual story, unusual for many of us, I think. Can I open the floor to questions first? Got one at the back, Yan Hong, and then one here in the front. I think one by one.
Thanks very much. You mentioned the Javanese touches. Obviously, there's the vocabulary, the flora and the fauna that you touched on. I wonder, is there any other evidence of syncretism, particularly involving pre-Islamic adat in terms of animistic beliefs, ancestor prayers, amulets, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think the answer is no. It's the other thing that I found quite interesting for its absence is there's no reference to any local identifiable person, king, ruler, family. There's no attempt to tie it in any way to anybody. It just sort of floats there. But no, there's no... all the things that are happening, even if they seem strange to us, are thought of as just standard Islamic stuff. And every now and then there's reference made. They say, according to Sahib al-Hikayat or Empunya al-Hikayat, but also they mention authorities like Ka'b al-Ahbar, so who is known, and they mention the title of Qisas al-Adbiya, the stories of the prophets. So there's an attempt made to say that this is good, attested stuff, but we've got some fun stuff. There's extra stuff plugged in. And I'm quite deliberate in saying fun here. I think there's an attempt at the use of humour at times. Sometimes it's a sort of a ghoulish humour, but that's all part of the mix, so to speak.
Michael, to what extent do you think that the strangeness of this text is a kind of an index of the sort of multiple and interconnecting literacies of Pesisir Java, where in the early to mid 19th century, you have Eurasians, Chinese, Javanese using Malay. I think at a slightly later date, you have newspapers publishing Malay texts in Urumi, saying they are dijawikan. So is it a Pesisir text?
I can't say, but what's also clear is it doesn't say that it's a text belonging to anyone. It never says that it's Malay. It never says that they've made it Jawi or Jawa. I'm speculating. So, for example, instead of saying Puncak, it's Kemuncak. There are different words and vocalization. My feeling, it's only a rough sense, is that it actually comes from somewhere closer to the western end of Java, and it comes from somewhere around Batavia. I even wondered whether this copy that I'd looked at had been a gift from someone working as a scribe, handling the Malay language stuff to the other guy, who I think was I've come across his name before as a scribe in the chancery, so to speak. But I'm really feeling my way here. Every time I think that I've got a part of the story that must be Indonesian, I then look up on Google and like today, I thought the Pasunila story, the story of the Nile vases, we've got something. And then I read about the story of the vat, which is Persian. So it's definitely very mixed. My only suspicion, I only recognise it as upma because I've only recently been introduced to upma for breakfast. It made me wonder about whether, during the British occupation of Java, there were lots of sepoys, are there people bringing some of the stories from India and, offering them in Malay? I don't know, but I'm only speculating. But it certainly speaks to a lot of mixing, but not mixing at times, given that there's just no real sense that if you want to learn about the life of Jesus, you would talk to a Christian. They don't know what they're talking about. We've got the tradition, thanks already. So,
thank you for that illuminating talk. I was wondering a very practical question. How many copies have you yet identified of the story? Because sometimes you can tell things about where the copies are and how many there might be.
So far, I've only looked closely at two, one in Paris, one in Princeton, and I've seen there are two more likely copies in Jakarta, but they haven't been made digitally available yet. So this was something that I was able to get onto because there are digital copies out there. I should say that the Parisian copy was used by some Indonesian scholars recently to write an article about it. And I thought, oh damn, it's done. And it's so strange. What they were interested in was almost nothing. I mean, they're interested in parts of, they're interested in the mission, the story of the Hawariun, and they're being rejected, and the sections about Maryam being instructed on where she could and could not go when she was having her period. And otherwise, they just pass over everything. But they did say, these scholars, we've identified at least 6 different copies, and the best one's in Paris. Well, actually, I think the Princeton one's a little bit better. I don't know why they decided that the Paris one was the best. I think it was because it's the oldest that anyone could find. But both of them bear signs of coming from an older text. But I don't know how much older is the other problem. And again, there's that problem of nomenclature. What do you call it? I now realise that perhaps I should be looking for Hikayat Zakaria as a possibility. Or perhaps this thing is nested in something else. So there could be an Indonesian Qasas al-Anbiya, if you like. So I've got to do a bit more digging. I think my main aim was just to try and work out, well, what might some people have imagined, or how might people have imagined the life of Jesus if they were Muslims living in Indonesia in the early part of the 19th century?
Sorry, you may have already answered this, but I was just curious about the authorship of the work and whether there are any indications as to the multiple authors, or is it a single author? And is there a voice that kind of runs through? Just curious to know.
Not one that I can, and this is very common in as far as I understand from the Hikayat tradition, but also Muslim authorship more generally, that you don't make yourself known. And yet we have this, like for example, Nawawi of Banten, when Snukakronya interviewed him in Mecca in 1885, he said proudly there was not one original thing in any of the books that he had written. He was just faithfully relaying a tradition. Then you have all these stories there. There's only this allusion to Sahib al-Hikayat, the owner of the text, or young Empunya, the person who owns it. Well, the text becomes something that everyone can own and change as they go along. And perhaps another part of this, an anecdote I'd like to relate, is when Haji Hassan Mustafa in the 1880s was sent to Aceh to instruct scribes in the Dutch administration about how to handle Malay texts. And he said, stop correcting them and stop making them better. Just relay what you have on the page, please. It's very important for our Dutch masters. They want to know what's actually written, not what you think should have been written. So there's a lot of not only correction, but enhancement goes on in a lot of texts. But yeah, this is not one that seems to be identified with any particular author, unlike the text that Ronit Ricci has worked with. You have the Book of 1,000 Questions. It's connected in some way to a known Jewish convert, Abdullah bin Salam. So you have something to sort of pin it on. This one, there's no one to pin the story on.
All right. Well, in that case, let's thank Professor Laffin once more. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you who have come and shared with us today. All the best, and thank you for your continued support of Indonesian at ANU. We hope to see you here next year for the next Tony and Yohanni Johns. Thanks. Also, let's give another round of applause for Tony and Yohanni. Thank you for coming tonight.